The morning mist hung heavy over the gardens of Ravencrest Palace as Prince Adrian stood at his study window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the ancient rose bushes that had bloomed for centuries. At 35, he carried himself with the practiced dignity expected of the heir to the throne of Valdoria. Yet this morning something felt different. The weight of responsibility that usually settled comfortably on his shoulders now felt crushing, like a stone pressing against his chest. Adrian had always prided himself on maintaining composure, even during the most challenging moments of his royal duties. When his mother, Queen Isabella, had passed away 3 years ago, he had stood beside his father, King Marcus, offering strength and solidarity as the nation grieved. When his father remarried Elena Sinclair 18 months later, Adrian had publicly supported the union, understanding that his father needed companionship in his twilight years. Elena had been a widow herself, having lost her first husband, Lord Christopher Sinclair, in a tragic hunting accident 5 years prior. She brought grace and warmth to the palace, and Adrian genuinely appreciated how she had helped his father emerge from the shadow of grief. Her 2 children from her previous marriage, Sebastian and Victoria, had integrated well into royal life, and Adrian had grown fond of his new step-siblings. But now everything felt uncertain. The previous evening had started like any other state dinner. Foreign dignitaries from a neighboring kingdom of Astoria filled the grand dining hall, their conversations mixing with the gentle melodies of the palace orchestra. Adrian had been seated between the Asturian ambassador's wife and a prominent businesswoman whose company had significant trade interests with Valdoria. The conversation flowed easily, covering topics from agricultural reforms to cultural exchange programs. Adrian noticed Elena across the table, resplendent in a deep blue gown that complemented the Valdorian crown jewel she wore. She was engaged in animated conversation with General Harrison, the kingdom's defense minister, and several other officials. Her laugh carried across the room, and Adrian smiled, remembering how his father often remarked that Elena's joy was infectious. It was during the third course that Adrian excused himself to take an important call from the Minister of Foreign Affairs regarding trade negotiations. He made his way through the palace corridors toward his private office, the sound of the dinner party fading behind him. The call lasted longer than expected, with complicated discussions about tariff adjustments and shipping agreements that required his immediate attention. When he finished the call nearly an hour later, Adrian decided to return to the dinner through the palace's east wing, which offered a shorter route back to the dining hall. The east wing contained several smaller meeting rooms and private sitting areas that the family used for informal gatherings. As he passed the blue salon, a room decorated with portraits of previous Valdorian monarchs, he heard voices through the partially open door. Adrian paused, not intending to eavesdrop, but recognizing Elena's voice speaking in hushed tones. What stopped him completely was hearing his own name mentioned, followed by words that made his blood run cold. Elena's voice carried clearly through the crack in the door. Adrian has no idea about the document. Marcus promised me that the succession modification would remain sealed until after the coronation ceremony. Once Adrian is crowned, it will be too late for him to contest the changes. The response came from a male voice Adrian didn't immediately recognize, though it sounded familiar. "Your Majesty, are you certain this is the wisest course of action? Prince Adrian has always been loyal to the crown and supportive of your marriage to His Majesty. Perhaps it would be better to discuss this openly with him." Elena's laugh held none of the warmth Adrian had come to associate with his stepmother. Loyalty and support are luxuries we cannot afford when the future of the kingdom is at stake. Adrian is too idealistic, too concerned with tradition. The modifications ensure that Sebastian will have a legitimate claim to the throne should anything happen to Adrian before he produces an heir. It's simply practical politics. Adrian felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. Sebastian, Elena's son from her previous marriage, was 28 years old and had been granted the honorary title of Duke of Westmore upon Elena's marriage to King Marcus. Adrian had always assumed this was merely a ceremonial gesture to help integrate Elena's children into the royal family structure. The conversation continued, but Adrian's mind was reeling. Secret modifications to the succession laws? Documents sealed from his knowledge? The implications were staggering. In Valdoria, succession had followed strict primogeniture for over 400 years. Adrian, as the eldest legitimate son of King Marcus, was the undisputed heir. Any changes to this ancient law would require parliamentary approval and public announcement. He pressed himself against the wall, struggling to process what he was hearing. Elena's voice continued, now discussing specific legal language and parliamentary procedures. The male voice, which Adrian now recognized as belonging to Lord Chancellor Pemberton, seemed to be outlining a complex strategy involving emergency powers and constitutional interpretations that could bypass traditional oversight mechanisms. The beauty of the plan, Elena explained, is that it appears to strengthen the monarchy rather than weaken it. By creating multiple lines of succession and establishing clearer protocols for regency, we're actually making the crown more stable. Parliament will see it as modernization, not manipulation. Adrian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The idea that his stepmother had been working behind his back to alter the fundamental structure of Valdorian monarchy was beyond comprehension. More troubling was the realization that his father must be aware of these changes. King Marcus had always been meticulous about constitutional matters, and any modification to succession laws would require his explicit approval. The conversation in the Blue Salon began to wind down, with Elena and Lord Chancellor Pemberton making plans to meet again the following week to review additional documentation. Adrian realized he needed to leave immediately to avoid being discovered. He quietly retreated down the corridor, his mind racing with questions and implications. The remainder of the state dinner passed in a blur. Adrian returned to his seat and mechanically participated in conversations, but his thoughts were entirely focused on what he had overheard. He watched Elena throughout the evening, searching for any sign of deception or guilt in her demeanor. She appeared completely natural, laughing at appropriate moments, engaging graciously with the foreign dignitaries, and playing the role of queen consort with apparent sincerity. When the dinner finally concluded and the guests had departed, Adrian retreated to his private chambers. His valet, Thomas, had laid out his evening clothes and prepared his usual nighttime tea, but Adrian dismissed him early, claiming fatigue. Alone in his sitting room, surrounded by family portraits and mementos from his years as heir apparent, Adrian tried to make sense of what he had learned. The implications extended far beyond personal betrayal. If Elena had indeed orchestrated secret changes to the succession laws, it represented a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. The Valdorian monarchy derived its legitimacy from centuries of consistent tradition and legal precedent. Any attempt to manipulate these foundations could destabilize the entire governmental structure. Adrian spent the night pacing his chambers, reviewing everything he knew about constitutional law and succession protocols. His education had been comprehensive, including extensive study of Valdorian legal history and governmental procedures. He had always assumed this knowledge would serve him well as king, helping him navigate the complex relationship between crown and parliament. Now he wondered if his education had been deliberately incomplete, designed to keep him ignorant of potential legal loopholes and constitutional vulnerabilities. As dawn approached, Adrian made a decision that would change everything. He would not confront Elena directly, nor would he immediately approach his father with accusations. Instead, he would conduct his own investigation, using his royal prerogatives and personal connections to uncover the truth about these alleged succession modifications. The first step would be accessing the royal archives, where all official documents related to the monarchy were stored. Adrian had legitimate reasons to review these materials as heir apparent, and his access would not raise immediate suspicions. He would begin by examining recent legislative submissions and constitutional amendments, looking for any evidence of the changes Elena had described. Adrian also decided to reach out to trusted advisors who might have knowledge of these developments. Sir Geoffrey Morrison, the longtime royal secretary, had served the crown for over 30 years and had an encyclopedic knowledge of palace procedures. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, Adrian's former constitutional law instructor, maintained close ties to the royal family and often advised on legal matters. As the sun rose over Ravencrest Palace, illuminating the ancient stones and casting long shadows across the courtyards, Adrian felt a cold determination settling over him. Whatever Elena and her collaborators had planned, he would uncover the truth. The crown had been entrusted to his family for generations, and he would not allow it to be compromised through deception and manipulation. The morning brought its usual schedule of appointments and obligations, but Adrian approached them with new awareness. Every interaction with palace staff, every conversation with government officials, every decision made in his capacity as heir apparent now carried additional weight. He realized that his entire understanding of his role and future had been built on assumptions that might be false. During breakfast with his father, Adrian studied King Marcus carefully, searching for signs that the elderly monarch was aware of Elena's activities. King Marcus appeared tired but alert, discussing the previous evening's dinner and the positive response from the Asturian delegates. He made no mention of succession issues or constitutional matters, leaving Adrian uncertain about his father's level of involvement. Elena joined them halfway through the meal, apologizing for her lateness and explaining that she had been reviewing charity commitments for the upcoming month. She kissed King Marcus on the cheek and smiled warmly at Adrian, asking about his plans for the day. Her behavior seemed completely natural, showing no indication that she was harboring secrets that could reshape the monarchy. As Adrian excused himself to begin his daily schedule, he caught Elena's eye across the breakfast table. For just a moment, he thought he detected something different in her expression, a calculating quality that he had never noticed before. But the moment passed quickly, and Elena returned to her conversation with King Marcus about landscaping plans for the palace gardens. Walking through the palace corridors toward his first appointment, Adrian felt the weight of his new knowledge pressing down on him. The familiar portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch him with expectation, reminding him of the centuries of tradition and duty that had brought him to this moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the strength and wisdom that his bloodline had always demanded. The investigation was about to begin, and Adrian knew that once he started down this path, there would be no turning back. The truth about Elena's secret would either vindicate his suspicions or destroy his understanding of everything he had believed about his family and his future as king. As he entered his office and began reviewing the day's correspondence, Adrian made a silent vow to his ancestors and to the people of Aldoria. He would uncover the truth, protect the crown's legitimacy, and ensure that the monarchy continued to serve the kingdom with honor and transparency, regardless of the personal cost to himself or his family relationships. #Behind the palace walls. Part 2. 3 days had passed since Adrian overheard Elena's conversation in the Blue Salon, and his investigation was already yielding disturbing results. The royal archives, housed in the ancient tower wing of Ravencrest Palace, had become his second home as he methodically reviewed documents dating back several months. Sir Geoffrey Morrison, the royal secretary, had been helpful without seeming suspicious, providing Adrian with access to legislative reviews and constitutional discussions that had taken place during the previous year. What Adrian discovered made his earlier concerns seem almost trivial by comparison. Hidden among routine parliamentary submissions and administrative updates were 3 separate constitutional amendments that had been quietly introduced and approved through emergency procedures. The amendments were written in dense legal language that obscured their true purpose, but Adrian's careful analysis revealed their combined effect. They created alternative succession pathways that could potentially bypass traditional primogeniture under specific circumstances. The First Amendment established new protocols for regency appointments, giving the monarch broader discretion in naming temporary rulers during periods of incapacity. The second created a formal role for royal advisors by marriage, granting significant constitutional authority to individuals who joined a royal family through matrimonial unions. The Third Amendment was the most troubling, as it established mechanisms for succession modification in extraordinary circumstances, allowing the Crown to adjust inheritance lines during national emergencies or constitutional crises. Adrian sat in the archives reading room, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and official documents, feeling a growing sense of betrayal. Each amendment had been presented to Parliament as a modernization effort, designed to strengthen the monarchy's ability to respond to contemporary challenges. The language was carefully crafted to seem reasonable and progressive, but their combined implementation created legal pathways that could fundamentally alter Valdorian succession practices. What made the discovery even more troubling was the timing. All three amendments had been introduced during the period when King Marcus was grieving Queen Isabella's death, and Elena was providing increasing support and counsel. The emergency procedures used to expedite their approval had bypassed the usual scrutiny and public discussion that constitutional changes typically required. Adrian requested additional documents from Sir Geoffrey, specifically focusing on the legal opinions and advisory reports that had supported these amendments. The royal secretary seemed puzzled by Adrian's interest in what he described as routine administrative updates, but he dutifully provided the requested materials without question. The advisory reports revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Lord Chancellor Pemberton had authored detailed legal analyses supporting each amendment, arguing that they were necessary responses to evolving constitutional challenges and contemporary threats to monarchical stability. The language was sophisticated and persuasive, drawing on historical precedents and comparative studies of other constitutional monarchies. However, Adrian noticed that several key advisors who typically reviewed such proposals have been excluded from the consultation process. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, whose expertise in constitutional law was widely respected, had not been asked to provide input. The Parliamentary Constitutional Committee, which normally scrutinized changes to royal succession laws, had been bypassed entirely through the emergency procedures. Adrian decided it was time to seek outside counsel. He arranged a private meeting with Professor Hartwell, using the pretense of seeking academic insight for a speech he was preparing about Valdorian governmental evolution. They met at her university office, a book-lined sanctuary filled with legal texts and historical documents. Professor Hartwell, a woman in her early 60s with sharp intelligence and decades of experience in constitutional matters, welcomed Adrian warmly. She had been his mentor during his university years, and their relationship had continued through regular consultations on legal matters affecting the crown. "Your Highness," she said, settling into her chair behind a desk covered with academic papers, "I'm delighted you're taking such an active interest in constitutional developments. Too many young royals ignore the legal foundations of their future responsibilities." Adrian chose his words carefully, not wanting to reveal the full extent of his suspicions. "Professor, I've been reviewing some recent legislative changes, particularly those related to succession protocols and royal authority. I'm curious about your thoughts on the constitutional amendments that were approved last year." Professor Hartwell's expression shifted slightly, and Adrian detected a note of concern in her voice. "I must admit, Your Highness, that I was surprised not to be consulted on those changes. Constitutional modifications affecting royal succession typically involve extensive academic review and public discussion. The emergency procedures used in this case were highly unusual." This confirmation of Adrian's suspicions sent a chill through him. "Were there specific aspects of the amendments that concerned you?" The professor leaned forward, her academic manner becoming more serious. Several elements were troubling from a constitutional perspective. The expansion of regency powers, while seemingly reasonable, creates potential conflicts with parliamentary authority. The formalization of roles for royal advisors by marriage represents a significant departure from traditional practices. Most concerning is the succession modification provision, which could theoretically allow fundamental changes to inheritance laws without proper legislative oversight. Adrian felt his worst fears being confirmed. Would such changes be legally binding? "That's the crucial question," Professor Hartwell replied, pulling a legal text from her bookshelf. The amendments were properly approved through existing emergency procedures, which gives them constitutional validity. However, their interpretation and implementation could be challenged in the Royal Constitutional Court. The legal language is sufficiently ambiguous that competing interpretations are possible. Adrian realized that Elena and her collaborators had created a legal gray area that could be exploited depending on circumstances and interpretation. The amendments provided tools that could be used to justify succession changes while maintaining a veneer of constitutional legitimacy. Professor, Adrian said carefully, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to challenge these amendments, what would be the proper procedure? Professor Hartwell studied him intently, clearly sensing that this was more than an academic inquiry. A constitutional challenge would require formal standing, typically from someone directly affected by the amendment's implementation. The challenger would need to demonstrate that the amendments violate fundamental constitutional principles or were improperly approved. Such challenges are rare and politically sensitive, particularly when they involve royal succession matters. Adrian thanked Professor Hartwell and left her office with a clearer understanding of his options, but also a deeper appreciation of the complexity he faced. Any attempt to challenge the amendments would require careful preparation and significant political courage, as it would inevitably create a constitutional crisis and public scrutiny of the royal family's internal dynamics. That evening, Adrian attended a family dinner in the palace's private dining room. King Marcus, Elena, Sebastian, and Victoria gathered around the intimate table that had witnessed countless family discussions over the years. The conversation covered routine family matters: Sebastian's upcoming diplomatic mission to the Commonwealth kingdoms, Victoria's charity work with children's education programs, and Elena's plans for modernizing palace hospitality protocols. Throughout the meal, Adrian watched his family members with new awareness, searching for signs of the conspiracy he was uncovering. Sebastian discussed his diplomatic assignment with enthusiasm, demonstrating impressive knowledge of international relations and trade policy. Adrian found himself wondering whether Sebastian was aware of the succession modifications that could potentially benefit him. Victoria, at 26, had always been the most politically astute of Elena's children. She spoke passionately about educational reform and social justice issues, showing the kind of progressive thinking that resonated with younger generations of Valdorians. Adrian noticed how naturally she participated in discussions about governmental policy, as though she expected to have ongoing influence in such matters. Elena herself appeared completely at ease, offering insights on various political and social issues while maintaining her role as supportive wife and stepmother. She asked Adrian about his recent activities, showing apparent interest in his schedule and commitments. When he mentioned spending time in the archives researching constitutional history, she smiled approvingly. "How wonderful that you're taking such an active interest in governmental foundations," Elena said, her voice warm with apparent pride. "Understanding our constitutional heritage is so important for effective leadership." Adrian managed to respond appropriately, but the irony of Elena's words was not lost on him. She was praising him for the very research that was uncovering her deception. After dinner, as the family prepared to retire to their respective chambers, Adrian lingered in the sitting room, hoping to observe any private interactions between Elena and her children. He pretended to review documents for the following day's appointments while watching the family dynamics unfold around him. Sebastian approached Elena for a brief, quiet conversation near the fireplace. Adrian couldn't hear their words, but he observed their body language carefully. Sebastian appeared to be seeking Elena's advice about something, and she responded with maternal warmth while occasionally glancing toward Adrian's location. The conversation concluded with Elena placing a reassuring hand on Sebastian's arm before he excused himself for the evening. Victoria's interaction with Elena was more businesslike. They discussed scheduling for upcoming charitable events and reviewed guest lists for various social functions. Again, Adrian noticed occasional glances in his direction, as though his presence was somehow relevant to their planning. When Adrian finally retired to his chambers, he found Thomas waiting with the evening's correspondence and a summary of the following day's appointments. Among the letters was a note from Lord Chancellor Pemberton requesting a private meeting to discuss constitutional matters of mutual interest. The timing seemed more than coincidental, given Adrian's recent investigation. Adrian dismissed Thomas and sat alone in his study, contemplating the meeting request. Was Pemberton aware of his investigation? Did Elena know that her secret was being uncovered? Or was this simply routine business that happened to coincide with his discovery? He decided to accept the meeting, recognizing that it could provide valuable intelligence about Elena's plans while also allowing him to gauge how much his activities had been noticed. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon in Pemberton's official chambers within the palace's administrative wing. Adrian spent much of the night reviewing his notes and evidence, preparing for what could be a crucial confrontation. He needed to be ready to defend his investigation while avoiding premature disclosure of what he had discovered. The meeting with Pemberton could either provide additional evidence of the conspiracy or alert Elena's collaborators to his growing awareness of their activities. As dawn approached, Adrian realized that his investigation had reached a critical juncture. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but his options for action remained limited and politically dangerous. Whatever happened in his meeting with Lord Chancellor Pemberton would likely determine the next phase of his response to Elena's deception. The palace bells chimed 6 times as Adrian finally attempted to rest, knowing that the following day would bring new challenges and potentially dangerous revelations. The truth about Elena's secret was becoming clearer, but the path forward remained uncertain and fraught with risks that could affect not only his own future, but the stability of the Valdorian monarchy itself. In the growing daylight, the ancient stones of Ravencrest Palace seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how the latest chapter in their long history would unfold. The crown that had passed from generation to generation for centuries now faced challenges that previous monarchs had never imagined, and Adrian found himself at the center of a constitutional crisis that could reshape the kingdom's future. #Behind the Palace Walls. Part 3. The meeting with Lord Chancellor Pemberton took place in his ornate office overlooking the palace's west courtyard, where afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows adorned with the royal coat of arms. Adrian arrived precisely on time, his composure carefully maintained despite the turmoil of emotions beneath the surface. Pemberton, a distinguished man in his late 50s with silver hair and sharp features, greeted Adrian with appropriate deference while maintaining the confident demeanor of someone who had served the crown for over 2 decades. His office reflected his position and personality. Imposing oak furniture, walls lined with legal volumes, and portraits of previous Lord Chancellors dating back 3 centuries. "Your Royal Highness," Pemberton said, gesturing toward a leather chair positioned across from his massive desk. "Thank you for making time in your schedule. I believe our discussion today will prove illuminating for both of us." Adrian settled into the offered chair, noting Pemberton's choice of words. The phrase "illuminating for both of us" suggested that this meeting involved more than routine constitutional business. Adrian decided to remain cautious, allowing Pemberton to reveal the true purpose of their encounter. "Lord Chancellor," Adrian replied formally, "I'm always available to discuss matters affecting the Crown's constitutional responsibilities. What specific issues did you wish to address?" Pemberton opened a leather portfolio containing several documents that Adrian recognized from his archive research. The Lord Chancellor's expression remained neutral, but Adrian detected a calculating quality in his gaze that hadn't been apparent during their previous interactions. "Your Highness, it has come to my attention that you've been conducting extensive research into recent constitutional amendments and succession protocols." Pemberton began, his tone measured and professional. "While such interest is certainly appropriate for the heir apparent, I thought it would be helpful to provide additional context for the changes that have been implemented." Adrian felt his pulse quicken, realizing that his investigation had indeed been noticed and reported. He maintained his composure while wondering how much Pemberton knew about his discoveries and whether Elena was aware of this conversation. "I appreciate your attention to my scholarly interests, Lord Chancellor," Adrian responded carefully. Constitutional history has always fascinated me, particularly the evolution of royal authority in response to changing societal needs. I assume the recent amendments represent similar evolutionary adaptations. Pemberton smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Precisely, Your Highness. The amendments address several vulnerabilities in our traditional succession protocols that could prove problematic in contemporary circumstances. Perhaps I could walk you through the specific considerations that influence these modifications. For the next 30 minutes, Pemberton provided a detailed explanation of the constitutional amendments that was far more comprehensive than anything Adrian had found in the official documentation. The Lord Chancellor outlined scenarios involving royal incapacity, disputed succession claims, and foreign interference that could threaten monarchical stability. What emerged from Pemberton's presentation was a sophisticated legal framework designed to provide maximum flexibility in managing succession crises. The amendments created multiple pathways for addressing challenges to royal authority while maintaining constitutional legitimacy. However, Adrian noticed that many of the scenarios Pemberton described seemed specifically crafted to justify intervention in circumstances that might apply to his own situation. These provisions are certainly comprehensive, Adrian observed, keeping his voice neutral. I'm curious about the consultation process that preceded their implementation. Were all relevant constitutional experts involved in their development? Pemberton's pause was almost imperceptible, but Adrian caught it. The emergency nature of contemporary threats required expedited procedures, the Lord Chancellor replied. However, I can assure you that all necessary legal authorities were consulted and approved the amendment's implementation. Adrian decided to probe deeper, despite the risks involved. I noticed that Professor Hartwell's expertise wasn't included in the review process. Given her extensive knowledge of succession law, that seems like an oversight. The Lord Chancellor's expression hardened slightly. Professor Hartwell's academic perspective, while valuable, doesn't always account for practical political realities. The amendments required input from individuals who understand both constitutional theory and contemporary governmental challenges. Adrian recognized that Pemberton was essentially admitting that the amendment had been designed with specific political objectives rather than purely constitutional considerations. The exclusion of traditional academic advisors made sense if the goal was to avoid scrutiny that might expose the amendment's true purposes. Lord Chancellor, Adrian said, deciding to take a calculated risk. I hope you understand that as heir apparent, I have both the right and responsibility to fully understand any constitutional changes that might affect the succession. Transparency in such matters is essential for maintaining public confidence in the crown. Pemberton leaned back in his chair, studying Adrian with increased intensity. Your Highness, I want to assure you that these amendments strengthen rather than threaten your position as heir apparent. They provide tools for addressing challenges that could arise during your future reign, ensuring that the monarchy can respond effectively to unforeseen circumstances. The conversation continued for another hour, with Pemberton outlining various theoretical scenarios and legal interpretations while Adrian asked pointed questions designed to reveal the amendment's true scope and purpose. What became increasingly clear was that the constitutional changes provided Elena and her collaborators with legal mechanisms for influencing succession decisions under circumstances that they could potentially create or manipulate. As the meeting concluded, Pemberton made what Adrian interpreted as a thinly veiled warning. Your Highness, I trust that our discussion has clarified any concerns you might have had about these constitutional developments. It's important that all members of the royal family understand and support the legal framework that protects our monarchical institutions. Adrian thanked Pemberton for his time and left the meeting with confirmation of his worst fears. The Lord Chancellor's presentation had been skillfully crafted to seem reasonable and protective of royal interests, but the underlying message was clear. The amendments existed, they had legal authority, and any challenges to their implementation would be met with sophisticated legal and political resistance. That evening, Adrian made a decision that would escalate his investigation to a new level. He contacted Captain James Morrison, the head of the Royal Protection Service, and Sir Geoffrey's younger brother. Captain Morrison had served the royal family for 15 years and had earned Adrian's complete trust through his discretion, competence, and loyalty. They met in Adrian's private study after midnight, when the palace staff had retired and the corridors were empty except for security personnel. Captain Morrison, a compact man in his early 40s with military bearing and intelligent eyes, listened carefully as Adrian explained his discoveries and concerns. "Your Highness," Captain Morrison said after Adrian finished his account, "these are serious allegations with significant security implications. If there's indeed a conspiracy to manipulate succession laws, it could represent a threat to constitutional stability and your personal safety." Adrian had been so focused on the legal and political aspects of Elena's deception that he hadn't fully considered the security dimensions. Captain Morrison's perspective added a troubling new element to an already complex situation. "What specific security concerns do you foresee?" Adrian asked. Captain Morrison consulted notes he had taken during Adrian's briefing. "Several possibilities come to mind, Your Highness. First, if these constitutional changes are designed to benefit Sebastian's succession prospects, there could be motivation to eliminate or discredit you as a rival claimant. Second, the conspiracy suggests coordination between Elena, Lord Chancellor Pemberton, and potentially other officials, indicating a broader network that we don't fully understand. Third, the legal framework they've created could be used to justify actions against you that would normally be considered illegitimate." The implications of Captain Morrison's analysis sent a chill through Adrian. What had started as discovery of constitutional manipulation was potentially something much more dangerous and personal. "Captain, I need to know the full extent of this conspiracy before deciding how to respond," Adrian said. "Can your resources help identify other individuals who might be involved?" Captain Morrison nodded. "The Royal Protection Service maintains detailed records of palace communications, meeting schedules, and visitor logs. With your authorization, I can review these materials for patterns that might reveal the conspiracy's scope and participants." Adrian provided the requested authorization, understanding that he was crossing a line that would make his investigation impossible to conceal much longer. If Captain Morrison's research uncovered additional conspirators or evidence of imminent threats, Adrian would need to take decisive action regardless of the political consequences. Over the following 3 days, Captain Morrison's discreet investigation revealed disturbing patterns in palace activities. Elena had been holding regular private meetings with Lord Chancellor Pemberton, Sebastian, and several other officials whose roles gave them influence over constitutional matters. These meetings were scheduled during times when Adrian was occupied with public duties or travel, suggesting deliberate efforts to exclude him from their discussions. More troubling was the discovery that Elena had been corresponding with legal experts from other Commonwealth kingdoms who specialized in succession law and constitutional reform. These communications suggested that Elena's plans extended beyond simple manipulation of Valdorian succession protocols to include broader strategies for modern monarchical governance. Captain Morrison also identified financial irregularities involving accounts associated with Elena's charitable foundations and Sebastian's diplomatic activities. Large sums of money were being transferred through complex networks that obscured their ultimate destinations, suggesting possible funding for activities related to the succession conspiracy. The security chief's most alarming discovery involved recent changes to palace security protocols. Elena had successfully lobbied for modifications to Adrian's protection arrangements, arguing that reduced security would help him appear more accessible to the public. These changes, implemented over Captain Morrison's initial objections, had created vulnerabilities in Adrian's daily schedule that could be exploited by hostile actors. "Your Highness," Captain Morrison reported during their final briefing, "the evidence suggests a comprehensive conspiracy involving constitutional manipulation, financial irregularities, and potentially compromised security arrangements. The scope and sophistication indicate long-term planning and significant resources." Adrian felt the weight of the captain's conclusions settling over him like a heavy cloak. What had begun as suspicion about succession changes had evolved into evidence of a complex conspiracy that threatened both his personal safety and the constitutional integrity of the Valdorian monarchy. The time for discreet investigation was ending. Adrian would soon need to decide whether to confront Elena directly, seek his father's intervention, or pursue other options that could protect the crown while exposing the conspiracy. Each potential course of action carried significant risks and unknown consequences that could reshape not only his own future, but the monarchy itself. As Adrian sat in his study reviewing Captain Morrison's detailed report, he realized that the next phase of this crisis would require political courage and strategic thinking that would test everything he had learned about leadership and responsibility. The crown that would one day rest upon his head suddenly felt heavier than he had ever imagined possible. Behind the palace walls. Part 4. The confrontation Adrian had been dreading came sooner than expected, triggered by events he couldn't have anticipated. On a gray Tuesday morning, as winter mist clung to the palace gardens, Sir Geoffrey Morrison appeared at Adrian's chamber door with news that would force all hidden agendas into the open. "Your Highness," Sir Geoffrey said, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain, "His Majesty has been rushed to the Royal Medical Center. He collapsed during his morning walk and remains unconscious. The physicians are conducting emergency evaluations." Adrian felt the world shift beneath his feet. King Marcus, despite his 72 years, had maintained excellent health and vigorous activity levels. His sudden collapse suggested serious medical complications that could trigger the very constitutional crisis Elena had been preparing for. The drive to the medical center gave Adrian precious minutes to consider the implications. If his father's condition proved serious or potentially fatal, the succession protocols would be activated immediately. The constitutional amendments Elena had orchestrated would come into effect, providing legal justification for interventions that could alter traditional succession procedures. At the medical center, Adrian found Elena already present, speaking quietly with the lead physician while Sebastian and Victoria waited in the family consultation room. Elena's demeanor was appropriately concerned, but Adrian couldn't help wondering whether his father's collapse was as unexpected as it appeared. Dr. Patricia Blackwood, the royal physician who had served the family for 15 years, provided a sobering medical assessment. King Marcus had suffered a severe stroke that had damaged critical brain functions. While he was stable, his prognosis remained uncertain, and full recovery was unlikely. The physicians estimated that the king would require months of intensive treatment, and his ability to resume royal duties was questionable. "Your Majesty," Dr. Blackwood addressed Elena formally. "Given His Majesty's condition, we need to consider implementing the medical incapacity protocols outlined in the recent constitutional amendments. The Royal Council will need to evaluate the king's ability to continue fulfilling his constitutional responsibilities." Adrian felt a cold realization wash over him. Elena's constitutional changes weren't just theoretical preparations for future crises. They were practical tools for managing the current situation. The timing of his father's stroke, combined with Elena's legal preparations, created circumstances that seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. Elena nodded gravely. "Dr. Blackwood, please prepare a comprehensive medical report for the Royal Council's review. We must ensure that all constitutional requirements are properly fulfilled during this difficult time." Adrian watched Elena's performance with growing suspicion. Her responses seemed rehearsed, as though she had anticipated exactly this scenario and prepared accordingly. When she suggested that Sebastian assist with coordinating communications between the medical team and royal officials, Adrian recognized the implementation of plans that had probably been months in preparation. That afternoon, the Royal Council convened an emergency session to address the constitutional implications of King Marcus's incapacity. The council, composed of senior governmental officials, military leaders, and constitutional experts, had the authority to declare royal incapacity and implement regency procedures under the recently modified protocols. Adrian attended the session as heir apparent, but He quickly realized that Elena's constitutional amendments had transformed his role from successor to potential subject of regency oversight. Lord Chancellor Pemberton presented the legal framework with practiced efficiency, outlining procedures that gave the council unprecedented authority over succession matters. Under the modified constitutional protocols, Pemberton explained to the assembled council members, royal incapacity creates circumstances requiring enhanced governmental oversight and potential succession adjustments to ensure monarchical stability. The council must evaluate not only His Majesty's current condition, but also the preparedness of potential successors to assume full royal responsibilities. Adrian recognized that Pemberton's presentation was setting the stage for challenging his own fitness to assume immediate royal authority. The language about preparedness of potential successors provided justification for imposing restrictions or conditions on his succession that could benefit Sebastian's position. General Harrison, the defense minister who had been present at the state dinner where Adrian first overheard Elena's conspiracy, raised questions about the stability of governmental operations during the transition period. His concerns seemed designed to support arguments for expanded regency powers and alternative succession considerations. The session concluded with a decision to establish a Regency Council with Elena as regent, supported by Lord Chancellor Pemberton and several other officials who had been instrumental in implementing the constitutional amendments. Adrian would retain his position as heir apparent, but would be subject to regency oversight until King Marcus recovered or formal succession procedures were implemented. Following the council meeting, Adrian requested a private conversation with Elena, recognizing that the time for discreet investigation had ended. They met in the palace's red drawing room, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own constitutional crises throughout Valdorian history. Elena, Adrian began, abandoning formal protocols in favor of direct confrontation. I know about the constitutional amendments and their true purpose. I know about your meetings with Pemberton and your plans to position Sebastian for succession. What I don't understand is why you've chosen to manipulate rather than collaborate. Elena's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of denying Adrian's accusations or expressing surprise at his knowledge, she simply smiled with what appeared to be relief that the pretense was finally ending. Adrian, she replied, her voice carrying none of the maternal warmth he had grown accustomed to, I had hoped we could avoid this confrontation until after the transition was complete. Your investigation has been thorough, though not as discreet as you probably believed. The admission that she had been aware of his activities confirmed Adrian's worst suspicions about the extent of her surveillance and control over palace operations. Elena had been monitoring his research while continuing to implement her plans, confident that her legal preparations provided adequate protection against any challenges he might mount. The constitutional amendments are legally valid and politically necessary, Elena continued. Valdoria needs leadership that understands contemporary challenges and can adapt traditional institutions to modern realities. Your attachment to historical precedent, while admirable, makes you unsuitable for the reforms our kingdom requires. Adrian felt anger rising within him, not just at Elena's betrayal, but at her presumption that she understood Valdorian needs better than he did. You've manipulated constitutional law to serve personal ambitions while undermining centuries of legal tradition. That's not reform. It's constitutional vandalism. Elena's expression hardened. Personal ambitions? Adrian, you've completely misunderstood my motivations. Sebastian's education and experience have prepared him for modern governance challenges that you've never faced. His diplomatic work, his understanding of international relations, his progressive approach to social issues make him better qualified to lead Valdoria into the 21st century. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Elena outlining her vision for Valdorian modernization under Sebastian's eventual leadership. She described constitutional reforms, social programs, and international partnerships that she believed would strengthen the kingdom's position while maintaining monarchical stability. What emerged from Elena's presentation was a comprehensive plan that extended far beyond simple succession manipulation. She had developed a detailed strategy for transforming Valdorian governance, using the constitutional amendments as tools for implementing changes that traditional procedures would never approve. Elena, Adrian finally said, recognizing that further argument was futile, your vision might have merit, but your methods are fundamentally wrong. Constitutional monarchy depends on legitimacy derived from legal tradition and public consent. Your manipulation undermines both foundations. Elena stood to conclude their meeting, her demeanor returning to the regal bearing appropriate for her position as regent. Adrian, legitimacy comes from effective governance and public benefit, not from historical precedent. The changes I've implemented will ultimately serve Valdoria's interests better than rigid adherence to outdated traditions. As Elena left the red drawing room, Adrian realized that the confrontation had clarified the stakes, but provided no resolution to the constitutional crisis. Elena's regency was legally established, her plans were already being implemented, and his options for response remained limited and politically dangerous. That evening, Adrian met again with Captain Morrison to assess his remaining alternatives. The security chief had continued monitoring palace communications and had identified concerning developments in Elena's coordination with foreign legal experts and financial networks. Your Highness, Captain Morrison reported, the evidence suggests that Elena's plans include formal recognition from other Commonwealth kingdoms for the constitutional changes. She's seeking international legitimacy for the succession modifications that would make any future challenges extremely difficult. Adrian realized that Elena's strategy was even more sophisticated than he had understood. By securing international recognition for her constitutional amendments, she was creating legal precedents that would protect Sebastian's eventual succession from both domestic and foreign challenges. The following morning brought news that would force Adrian's final decision. King Marcus's condition had deteriorated overnight, and the physicians indicated that recovery was no longer possible. The constitutional protocols would soon require formal succession procedures, activating the full scope of Elena's amended legal framework. Adrian found himself facing a choice that would determine not only his own future, but the direction of Valdorian monarchy for generations to come. He could accept Elena's regency and the gradual implementation of her modernization plans, preserving family unity while sacrificing traditional constitutional principles. Alternatively, he could mount a legal challenge to the constitutional amendments, risking a public crisis that could destabilize the monarchy while potentially protecting its historical legitimacy. As he stood once again at his study window, watching the morning mist rise from the palace gardens where centuries of his ancestors had walked, Adrian felt the weight of history pressing upon his decision. The crown that awaited him represented both privilege and responsibility, tradition and adaptation, personal ambition and national service. The choice he made in the coming hours would echo through Valdorian history, determining whether the ancient monarchy would evolve through Elena's constitutional manipulation or whether traditional legal principles would prevail despite the personal and political costs of resistance. In the growing daylight, the stones of Ravencrest Palace seemed to await his decision, ready to witness another chapter in the long story of Valdorian governance. The secret behind the palace walls had been revealed, but its ultimate consequences remained to be determined by the courage and wisdom of a prince who must choose between family loyalty and constitutional duty in the most challenging moment of his life.